In the dim corridors of the Demonic Academy's dorms, chaos erupted as fists clashed and blood splattered against the cold stone walls. Chun Jongsum, the proud scion of the Poison Clan, was being beaten down without mercy, his composure shattered beneath the unrelenting blows, leaving him sprawled and humiliated before his peers. The watching cadets rushed to his side in a panic, calling out to the fallen prince in desperation. Their alarm soon turned to fury as they faced the one responsible, Baek-gi, the unassuming cadet marked with the number 18. Their voices rose like a storm, filled with outrage and disbelief that anyone would dare strike a royal from the Poison Clan. But Baek-gi stood unmoved. To him, titles held no weight within these walls. Power alone decided one's fate. He had fought, he had won, and by the Academy's own law, leadership of Group 12 now belonged to him. When dawn broke, the scent of iron still lingered faintly in the air. The cadets assembled at the training ground, their bodies bruised and eyes heavy from a night of violence. The Fire King Lee Ha-meng observed the sea of faces with a knowing look. As expected, the strongest had naturally risen to lead. Others bore marks of defeat, swollen faces, broken pride, the aftermath of the Academy's silent initiation. This was why the instructors had kept their distance the previous night. They had wanted the cadets to fight, to bleed, and to find their own hierarchy through force. Yet Ha-meng's sharp gaze soon caught something that defied order. Group 12, once meant to be led by a royal of the Poison Clan, now stood under Baek-gi's command. His eyes narrowed. The signs of last night's battle were unmistakable. A brutal contest had taken place, and Baek-gi had emerged victorious. To have dared strike a prince bearing the black name tag, such audacity spoke of more than skill. It revealed unflinching courage. As the murmur of cadets settled, Ho-jin Chang's voice broke the silence, signaling the day's beginning. Ha-meng gave a slight nod. Chang's commanding voice cut sharply through the morning air, drawing every cadet's attention. For the next 7 days, he announced, each morning would be devoted to mastering the fundamentals of tactics and strategy within the right side auditorium. Afternoons after lunch would be reserved for physical training on the practice field. A thunderous response followed as the cadets shouted in unison. Chang gave a curt nod, signaling the beginning of their march toward the auditorium. Group by group, they began to move in disciplined formation. As the lines advanced, disdain rippled through the ranks. The other heirs glanced toward Chun Jongsum with visible contempt, their eyes sharp with derision. Among them, Mukum stepped forward, his words laced with venomous amusement. To him, Jongsum's defeat was not merely a loss, it was a humiliation that stained the name of the Poison Clan. His sneering tone dripped with mockery as he taunted that the clan's strength was nothing without its toxins. His laughter echoed cruelly, lingering like a slap to Jongsum's pride. Jongsum's jaw tightened as rage brewed beneath his composed facade. The humiliation clawed at him, but he bit back his anger, his eyes burning with silent fury. Inside, his thoughts seethed. He recognized the man who had defeated him, Baek-gi, from one of the Academy's top clans. The insult was intolerable. Inwardly, he swore vengeance, promising himself that Baek-gi would pay for the shame he had brought upon him. Later that night, Impyong called Cadet 3. Mukum responded, awaiting the instructor's words. Impyong regarded him with a measured look, noting his earlier display during the formation exercises. His performance had been satisfactory. A flicker of pride crossed Mukum's face. Though he masked it behind a polite tone, satisfaction stirred quietly within him. As the instructor mentioned Cadet 7's condition, his tone carried mild concern. He explained that the young cadet would remain in the infirmary for 2 weeks, as ordered by the doctor. Though the theory could still be studied, practice would be out of reach. A quiet doubt lingered in his voice, whether someone without Nagong could ever catch up. With that, he dismissed the group, urging them to make good use of their time before leaving. The moment he disappeared from sight, Mukum's restraint shattered. A furious growl escaped his throat as he stomped the ground, the echo of his frustration rippling through the training hall. The other cadets flinched at the display, whispering among themselves to remain silent. They knew well that provoking his volatile temper would only make things worse. Mukum's chest heaved with rage, his teeth grinding as if the very thought was poison. The idea of Cheon Yeo-Woon resting comfortably in the infirmary for 2 weeks seared at his pride. Among the onlookers, Cadet Jaehyun stepped forward carefully, urging the prince to calm himself. He reasoned that if the doctor had declared it so, there was no deceit behind it. But as he spoke, Mukum's glare sharpened. The words only fed his fury. Still, Jaehyun did not retreat. Instead, he leaned closer and began to whisper something under his breath. His words were soft, deliberate, and whatever plan he suggested made Mukum's expression shift. The storm in his eyes gave way to a sinister calm, his lips curving slowly into a thin, satisfied smile. 5 days passed. Inside the quiet infirmary, Jongmeng sat slouched over his desk, staring at the empty beds that mocked his patience. Since Cheon Yeo-Won's recovery, no one had stepped through those doors. The silence gnawed at him and boredom settled like dust in the air. He muttered to himself, half in jest and half in despair, wondering if that stubborn cadet would forever remain his last patient. As his eyes eyelids grew heavy, the infirmary door suddenly slammed open. In-pyung rushed in, breaking the stillness with urgent footsteps. Jong-mung straightened at once, his drowsiness vanishing as he spotted the figure being carried in. A flicker of excitement ran through him. Finally, a patient. He masked it quickly beneath professional composure, rising to assess the situation. In-pyung's tone was clipped, his words heavy with concern. One of his cadets had been struck during sword training. He hadn't dared to remove the blade, fearing it would worsen the injury, and had brought the boy straight there. Jong-mung wasted no time. He ordered the wounded cadet to be placed on the nearest bed, his hands already reaching for tools and cloth. The steady rhythm of his stitching soon followed. In-pyung, watching closely, exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, remarking on the healer's skill, calling him worthy of his mentor's legacy. Jong-mung gave a small, knowing smile. He credited the man's quick decision not to pull the sword, a mistake that could have easily cost the boy his life. In-pyung asked after the cadet's condition, his expression tight with worry. Jong-mung's answer came with calm relief. The strike had missed all vital areas. The boy's fortune, it seemed, was stronger than his recklessness. At that, In-pyung sank into a nearby chair, his body finally easing as the tension drained away. Jong-mung glanced at him with quiet amusement. Beneath the man's stern discipline, there was genuine concern. He noted as much, teasing lightly that perhaps the instructor cared more than he let on. In-pyung sighed, his gaze turning distant. Until the second test, these cadets were his to guide, and already 2 of them lay confined within the infirmary walls. Jong-mung examined the injury one last time, his practiced eyes tracing the freshly stitched wound. Though the bleeding had stopped, the cut ran deep. He concluded that the cadet would need to remain under observation for a few days. In-pyung, momentarily alarmed by the word hospitalized, exhaled in relief when told it would only be for 3 days. Nothing as severe as Cadet 7's case. With that reassurance, he handed the responsibility over to Jong-mung, asking him to watch over Cadet 23 until training resumed. When the 2 men stepped out of the infirmary, silence returned once more. But it was not the calm kind. From the bed where Cadet 23 lay supposedly unconscious, a faint rustle broke the still air. Slowly he stirred, lifting himself from the sheets with deliberate care. His eyes darted about the room, scanning the doorway and corners until he was certain no one else was present. He crept toward the doctor's cabinet, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached inside. From within, he drew a small surgical knife, its blade catching the dim light as if reflecting the malice behind his intent. Pulling it aside, he revealed Cheon Yeo-Woon lying motionless. The sight stirred a cold determination in the cadet's eyes. He whispered that he did not wish for this, but that it was the only way to protect himself. Then, lowering the blade, he placed it against Yeo-Woon's leg, aiming to sever the muscle that would cripple him permanently. But before the knife could pierce skin, an invisible current surged through the air. The nanomachine within Yeo-Woon stirred to life, detecting the threat before the blow could land. A mechanical voice echoed within his consciousness, reporting the imminent danger and initiating a countermeasure. An instant later, a violent surge of electricity burst through the knife. The cadet convulsed, his scream ripping through the quiet room as the current scorched his body. At that moment, Yeo-Woon's eyes fluttered open. Calm and unshaken, he gazed down at the fallen figure beside his bed, his voice low and certain as he murmured to himself, just as he had suspected. In the quiet of the infirmary, the night pressed heavily against the windows of the Demonic Academy's main building. Then, a low groan broke the silence. The 23rd cadet stirred, consciousness returning in fragments after the shock that had felled him earlier. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, a cold realization struck him. His body would not move. Thick ropes bound him tightly to the bed, digging into his wrists and ankles. Panic clawed at his throat as he twisted and pulled, but the knots held firm. Fear crept up his spine as he muttered shakily, demanding to know who had done this to him. The answer came from behind the curtain. The fabric slid aside and Yeo-Woon stepped into view. The cadet's breath caught as disbelief twisted across his face. He stammered in confusion, unable to understand how Yeo-Woon could be standing there unscathed. Yeo-Woon's gaze was cold, his tone laced with quiet mockery as he called him Baldy, and reminded the cadet that it had been easy to tie him down while he lay unconscious. The cadet's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling in panic. None of it made sense. Yeo-Woon had been gravely injured. He should not even be walking, and yet the man before him stood perfectly composed. But why was Yeo-Woon calling him bald? Then Yeo-Woon held up a small mirror, wordlessly turning it toward him. What the cadet saw froze him completely. His reflection stared back, stripped of pride, stripped of hair. His scalp gleamed under the faint light. Horror twisted his expression as his hand reflexively tried to reach for the absent strands. His voice cracked in disbelief, the realization hitting him harder than the pain itself. But his outburst was short-lived. Yeo-Woon's fist came down swiftly, silencing the noise with a precise strike that sent him back into unconsciousness. Yeo-Woon exhaled softly, remarking under his breath that the man was far too loud. Perhaps a rag would quiet him next time. He pulled out a chair and sat beside the bed, watching the subdued figure. When the cadet finally stirred once more, clarity dawned in his eyes. Yeo-Woon questioned whether the man had finally calmed. The young man struggled against the gag, muffled sounds escaping his mouth, but Yeo-Woon's eyes remained sharp, mocking him of his dire state. The cadet's heart pounded beneath the weight of that gaze. He had once mistaken Yeo-Woon for someone naive, harmless even, back at the entrance ceremony, but now, bound and trembling, he saw the shadow of someone far more dangerous. Who exactly was this man? Without breaking eye contact, Yeo-Woon raised a blade, its edge glinting faintly under the infirmary's dim light. His tone turned colder as he spoke of survival, of the countless attempts on his life, of assassins who had tried to poison or kill him. He had endured it all. The knife's edge met the cadet's throat, pressing just enough to draw a thin line of dread across his skin. Yeo-Woon's expression barely changed as he leaned closer. He reminded the cadet of the pain of a stab wound, letting him imagine its burn, its finality. Fear seized the cadet's face. Yeo-Woon's tone sharpened like the blade itself as he demanded the truth, the name of whoever had sent him. When he finally removed the gag, the cadet gasped for breath. For a moment, it seemed he might confess. But then, with a forced smirk, he hid his fear behind arrogance. His voice carried trembling defiance as he reminded Yeo-Woon of the academy's rules, how harming another student outside of training or duels was forbidden. Yeo-Woon's expression hardened, his eyes sharp with cold amusement as he realized the cadet's defiance would not break easily. The young man before him spat back his courage, his body trembling but his pride unyielding. Yet behind that bravado, he laughed inwardly, mocking Yeo-Woon in silence, believing this test of endurance would prove his strength. But Yeo-Woon's faint smile carried something darker. With quiet resolve, he slipped the rag back into the cadet's mouth and moved toward the nearby cabinet. The metallic clatter of objects echoed as he searched, his gaze settling upon a set of long, thin needles gleaming under the faint light. He murmured to himself with a trace of dark amusement, recalling the lack of such tools in the place he once called home. Now, surrounded by them, his intent sharpened. The cadet's heartbeat quickened. Panic crept into his mind as realization dawned upon him. His thoughts spiraled. Needles! What is he going to do with those? When Yeo-Woon grasped his wrist, the cadet instinctively clenched his fist, but it was futile. The cadet's mind screamed in disbelief. How can he be this strong? Why was he forcing his hand open? Without another word, Yeo-Woon drove the first needle between the cadet's finger and nail. A muffled scream tore through the rag, his veins bulging, his entire body convulsing under the unbearable sting. He lifted another needle and pressed it into a second nail, drawing out another strangled cry that filled the dim room. The pain was blinding. The cadet writhed, his body trembling violently as tears streamed down his face. 2 needles felt like an eternity of torment. Yeo-Woon, unmoved, regarded the suffering boy with detached calm. This was not interrogation, it was retribution. He reminded the cadet of his earlier words, declaring this act not as torture for confession, but as his own form of vengeance. The cadet's defiance shattered. His body quivered uncontrollably as he tried to form words, but the gag silenced him. The agony drowned all thought. One by one, Yeo-Woon continued, driving the remaining needles beneath the nails until every finger on the left hand bore the mark of pain. By the time it ended, the cadet had already fainted twice. Yeo-Woon stood up and dragged the chair to the right side of the bed. The 23rd cadet immediately realized what that meant and began to cry in fear. He struggled to speak, trying hard to spit out the rag from his mouth. Yeo-Woon noticed the attempt and removed the rag. The cadet coughed heavily, his chest rising and falling as he gasped for air. Fear filled his mind. As he thought that anyone else would have gone insane from such pain, he decided to speak before things got worse. As he tried to form words, Yeo-Woon spoke first, mentioning the name Cheon Yeo-Woon. The cadet froze, his face showing clear shock at how Yeo-Woon could have known. Yeo-Woon continued, explaining that because of the lessons given daily by the instructor, arranged under Cheon Yeo-Woon's persistence, he had learned in detail about the groups and their members. He said he had already suspected the truth, but wanted to confirm it from the cadet himself, calling him by his name, Hobum. Hobum swallowed hard. Realization and fear washed over him as he finally understood Yeo-Woon's true nature. The cadet he once thought weak and harmless had known everything from the start, concealing his strength and awareness. The thought of what Yeo-Woon might become once stronger filled Hobum with silent dread. Yeo-Woon stated that he had gained sufficient information and decided to end the matter, saying he would rest. Hobum, uncertain and trembling, hesitated before responding. Fear filled him as he rushed to assure Yeo-Woon that he would never reveal what had happened. His voice shook as he pleaded for forgiveness, promising silence and submission. His body bowed in obedience, but Yeo-Woon only gave a faint grin and extended his hand toward him. Yeo-Woon pressed a finger against a blood point on Hobum's body. Almost immediately, Hobum's eyelids grew heavy, and his body went limp as he fell into unconsciousness. The technique required control over internal energy, something Hobum knew Yeo-Woon was believed to lack. Realization struck him in that final moment. Yeo-Woon had been deceiving everyone about his abilities. The 23rd cadet's first day in the medical room ended in silence, marked by exhaustion, fear, and and a secret that only he would carry. A few hours later, Submeng entered the medical room as he did every day. This time, however, there was a spark of anticipation in his steps. His excitement stemmed from Yeo-Won's remarkable progress. He had successfully cultivated internal energy within his stomach just the previous day. Submeng stood astonished. The progress that usually required 2 or 3 weeks, or even a month for some, had been achieved in only 5 days. His earlier estimate of a week had already been surpassed. He reflected on the achievement with quiet admiration. In his mind, he acknowledged that Yeo-Won had exceeded all expectations. His original plan, to help Yeo-Won gain internal energy within 2 weeks before moving on to basic techniques and breathing methods, would now have to change. Yeo-Won greeted his teacher respectfully that morning. Submeng acknowledged the greeting and asked where the item had been placed. Yeo-Won replied that it was kept beneath his bed. At his teacher's instruction, he went to retrieve it. From beneath the bed, Yeo-Won drew out a small wooden chest. Inside lay the Black Dragon Ball, a creation of the Demonic Academy formed using rare medicinal herbs. It was a pill granted only to those who passed the first test. When properly absorbed, it granted internal energy equal to 20 years of cultivation. However, its effect diminished with any subsequent use, as the body developed resistance after the first dose. When Yeo-Won opened the chest, a strong, pungent scent of herbs spread through the room. The thick aroma lingered heavily in the air. Submeng examined the item closely, silently remarking to himself that its smell remained as unpleasant as ever. He assessed that if Yeo-Won consumed it properly, he would gain immense internal energy, enough to stand on his own without assistance. As his gaze shifted across the room, Submeng noticed a figure lying behind the curtains. Curious, he approached and pulled them aside. There, he saw a bald boy with linen bandages wrapped around his upper body. The boy remained motionless, deeply asleep under the effect of a blood point strike. Submeng questioned Yeo-Won, noticing the unconscious boy, and asked if he had interfered with the cadet's blood points. Yeo-Won explained calmly that the boy had attacked him after Dr. Jongmeng had left the room. Submeng was taken aback by the revelation and sought clarification. Yeo-Won continued, stating that ever since the previous day, the 6th day since their arrival at the academy, training had begun using real swords. He believed the cadet had deliberately injured himself with a real blade in order to approach him without suspicion. Submeng's expression hardened at the explanation. The thought of such an act taking place within the infirmary angered him. He knew that if discovered, such behavior could lead to immediate expulsion. The cadet's boldness suggested either recklessness or obedience to an order from someone with influence. Judging by Yeo-Won's composed reaction, Submeng suspected that Yeo-Won already knew who was behind it and asked for confirmation. Yeo-Won replied that it was the boy from the loyal clan who belonged to the same group as him. Submeng was momentarily startled, then let out a faint scoff. He acknowledged that the loyal clan was known for its arrogance and troublesome nature, and commented that Yeo-Won's situation must be difficult because of their involvement. Yeo-Won responded with quiet indifference, saying that he was accustomed to it. Submeng observed him silently and thought to himself that the calm way Yeo-Won spoke made the situation even more pitiful. He then reached toward the unconscious cadet and pressed his blood point again. Turning to Yeo-Won, he offered guidance, explaining that if internal energy equal to 1 year or less was used, the effect of the blood point technique would fade within a few hours, but for a lasting result, at least 10 years worth of internal energy was required. Yeo-Won listened attentively and acknowledged the advice with a brief nod, keeping the instruction firmly in mind. Submeng instructed Yeo-Won to begin consuming the Black Dragon Ball. Yeo-Won asked if it should simply be swallowed, but Submeng explained that it must be chewed first to ensure full absorption of its energy. Following the instruction, Yeo-Won placed the pill in his mouth and bit into it. A strong, bitter taste spread instantly, accompanied by a foul smell that made his stomach twist. The bitterness numbed his tongue and made him want to gag, but he forced himself to continue until the entire pill was chewed and swallowed. Submeng reminded him to begin using his breathing techniques once it was consumed. Yeo-Won acknowledged the command and sat cross-legged on the floor, focusing his posture for cultivation. Submeng moved behind him and placed both hands on Yeo-Won's back. He began channeling internal energy into Yeo-Won's body, helping to guide and stabilize the medicinal flow. As the essence of the Black Dragon Ball began spreading through his system, an unfamiliar voice echoed inside Yeo-Won's mind. Nano's voice informed him that a substance-aiding energy activity had entered his body and was reacting to his internal flow. It then asked whether he would allow the process to accelerate by promoting a faster energy cycle. Though Yeo-Won did not fully grasp the meaning, he understood that Nano intended to assist him and gave his consent. Immediately after, Nano announced that it was stimulating the body's metabolism. The nanomachine within him activated rapidly, enhancing his internal processes and speeding up the absorption of the Black Dragon Ball's energy throughout his body. Submeng was taken aback by what he witnessed. Internally, he questioned how Yeo-Won's body could respond in such a way. The absorption was far beyond normal. His body was not only drawing in the medicinal energy, but amplifying it to a level unheard of. Normally, even a talented student could only absorb about 80% of the Black Dragon Ball's power, yet Yet Yeo-Woon seemed to be taking in every trace of it. What had begun as a cautious concern now turned into astonishment and relief. Determined not to let any of the energy go to waste, Submeng maintained his focus, guiding the internal flow with precision. Hours passed in complete silence. After nearly 2 hours of steady concentration, the process was complete. Submeng exhaled heavily, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and drank from a bottle to replenish himself. He then turned to Yeo-Woon and asked how it felt to possess internal energy. With a satisfied tone, he commended Yeo-Woon, telling him that he had successfully gained 1.5 times the expected amount of Naegong. Yeo-Woon was left in disbelief. That meant the energy equivalent of 30 years of cultivation now resided within him. Submeng clarified that it was only an estimate, explaining that most students who absorbed the medicine alone would likely fail to take in even half of it. Yeo-Woon expressed sincere gratitude, crediting his teacher for the success. Submeng simply laughed it off, saying that fortune had favored him. Within his mind, Yeo-Woon directed his thoughts toward Nano, silently thanking it for the help. Nano responded with its usual calmness, stating that assisting him was its function and purpose. As dawn broke, sunlight began to stream through the window. Submeng noticed the time and rose from his seat. While preparing to leave, Yeo-Woon called out to him, requesting to be taught the blade skill formation. Submeng paused, then nodded in approval. He agreed without hesitation, reminding Yeo-Woon that his training time was limited and that he should be ready. It was a lesson Submeng had intended to begin soon, but hearing the request from Yeo-Woon himself brought him quiet satisfaction. Later that day, Dr. Jungmyeon caught sight of the bald 23rd cadet and immediately burst into laughter. The sight of the boy's shaved head and bandaged scalp was enough to make him lose composure. The cadet clenched his fists tightly, holding back the anger that surged within him. He knew he could not afford to react, not after what had happened with Yeo-Woon. Any act of defiance might draw unwanted attention or worse, provoke Yeo-Woon's displeasure. Jungmyeon quickly realized his mistake and apologized while trying to suppress his laughter. He pulled the curtain around the bed to give the boy some privacy. From the cadet's expression and silence, he sensed that something unusual must have occurred overnight. However, as a doctor within the academy, he had learned not to question such matters. He let it pass without comment. Elsewhere, at the morning training ground, Chun Mukum appeared in high spirits. A bright smile spread across his face as he greeted the day. Thanks to Jahoon's plan of sending the 23rd cadet to the infirmary, Mukum believed the situation with Yeo-Woon had been taken care of. For the past 2 days, the 8th group had enjoyed quiet nights without any disturbance, and Mukum felt assured that his problem had been resolved. 2 days later, during dinner time after afternoon training, the 23rd cadet finally returned. His head was wrapped in small cloth bandages, and his expression was lifeless. When Mukum saw him, his face twisted in irritation. He had assumed the boy would have been expelled after failing his task. The cadet quickly explained that he had intended to injure the 7th cadet's tendons as ordered, but Yeo-Woon's wounds had drawn the doctor's full attention. Jungmyeon had stayed by Yeo-Woon's side all night, treating him without rest. Mukum's expression darkened further. The explanation sounded like a poor excuse. He demanded to know if the doctor never slept and accused the cadet of failure. The 23rd cadet stammered, trying to justify himself, saying that he had indeed moved according to Mukum's orders, but the doctor had awoken during the attempt. Before he could finish, Mukum's patience broke. His foot slammed into the cadet's stomach, sending him sprawling to the ground. He shouted in anger, furious that the task had been botched. Mukum continued to kick him repeatedly as the cadet curled up, unable to resist or speak. Finally, Jae-Hun intervened, stepping forward to stop him. He told Mukum to hold back. When Mukum turned on him irritably, Jae-Hun ignored his tone and instead questioned the cadet, asking for the doctor's name. The 23rd cadet, breathing heavily from the blows, answered weakly between gasps. The 23rd cadet, Hobam, finally managed to answer. He said that the doctor's name was Baek Jongmeng. Jae-Hun repeated the name under his breath, his tone thoughtful. The name sounded familiar and he began to recall its connection. When Mukum asked if it was someone he knew, Jae-Hun explained that Baek Jongmeng was likely a disciple of Dr. Baek Jong-woo. Mukum's expression changed instantly. The name Baek Jong-woo was not one to be taken lightly. He was a member of the Poison Clan, a man deeply skilled in medicine and also renowned as the personal physician of the Lord himself. Despite his role as a doctor, Baek Jong-woo was known to rank among the top 30 warriors of the entire demonic cult. Jae-Hun noted that although it was not fully confirmed if the doctor currently stationed in the academy was indeed Baek Jong-woo's disciple, then his martial abilities were likely formidable as well. Hearing this, Mukum grew frustrated. He glared at the injured cadet and cursed under his breath, recognizing that sending Hobam had been a wasted effort. Mukum's anger flared again, and he began kicking the 23rd cadet repeatedly to vent his frustration. Each blow landed with force, and the cadet's body twisted in pain as he struggled to endure it. Mukum shouted at him, warning him not to expect any help or support from his clan. As the kicks continued, Hobum's mind drifted back to his earlier conversation with Mukum. He remembered how Mukum had approached him with feigned confidence, addressing him by name and offering an enticing promise. Mukum had reminded him of his status as the heir of the Spring Clan and had asked for his cooperation. In return, he had promised to support Hobum's small clan if anything went wrong or if expulsion ever became a threat. Now, as the pain grew sharper with every strike, bitterness filled Hobum's thoughts. He realized that Mukum's promise had meant nothing. If that assurance had been real, he would have confessed everything without hesitation. Rage boiled quietly within him as he endured the assault, silently daring Mukum to continue. He told himself that once Yeo-Woon appeared, Mukum would no longer have the upper hand. Mukum suddenly noticed the cloth wrapped around the cadet's head and reached down to pull it off. When he removed it, a moment of silence fell. The sight of the bald head startled him for an instant, but his expression quickly hardened again. He accused Hobum of trying to appear repentant by shaving his head, as if that act alone would earn forgiveness. Without hesitation, he kicked him once more. Around them, the other cadets watched uneasily. Whispered remarks spread among them, expressing annoyance and concern. They had thought the group would finally have peace, but the commotion had returned, breaking the quiet of the quarters once again. Mukum, still irritated, announced that he was leaving and called for Jae-hun to follow. Jae-hun responded immediately, and the two walked out together. Left on the ground, Hobum lay motionless, his body aching and his thoughts dark. Anger and resentment clouded his mind as he glared upward. Inwardly, he cursed both Mukum and Yeo-Woon, wishing misfortune upon them both. During that time, Yeo-Woon asked Dr. Jung-Meng whether he could also use martial arts. Jung-Meng seemed surprised by the question and replied that he had never learned martial arts, as his knowledge was limited to medicine alone. 7 days later, at 6 in the morning, Sub-Meng visited the medical room as usual and found Yeo-Woon already practicing diligently. Observing him, Sub-Meng noted to himself that Yeo-Woon's progress was remarkable. Despite only being shown the butterfly technique a few times and having his posture corrected occasionally, his movements had already become stable and natural. Sub-Meng thought that if Yeo-Woon continued training at this pace, he would soon be capable of operating expressions without difficulty. Sub-Meng then called out the next sequence for practice, and Yeo-Woon immediately prepared to demonstrate. Internally, Yeo-Woon adjusted his focus. Nano had already scanned and analyzed his teacher's form, allowing him to replicate it with perfect accuracy, but Yeo-Woon intentionally moved a little slower to avoid drawing suspicion. His execution was smooth and precise, the transitions flowing seamlessly from one stance to another. Sub-Meng watched carefully, analyzing his progress. The butterfly technique's structure was intricate. 24 starting expressions, with every 3 forming a single movement pattern, creating 8 complete expressions in total. Teaching the fundamentals alone had consumed much of their limited time. Sub-Meng regretted that he had not been able to teach the connecting transitions. With 1 or 2 more months, Yeo-Woon could have mastered the technique entirely, but their week together was too short. After a while, Sub-Meng ended the session, acknowledging that Yeo-Woon had memorized the material thoroughly. Yeo-Woon bowed respectfully, humbly accepting his teacher's praise. Sub-Meng then handed him a folded piece of paper. It contained the foundational expressions of the butterfly technique along with the Nagong operation methods. He told Yeo-Woon that he had intended to continue teaching personally, but since their time together had ended, he was entrusting him with this written guide. Confident in Yeo-Woon's intelligence and understanding, he encouraged him to master the basics on his own. Before leaving, he reminded him that he would verify the progress the next time they met and urged him not to neglect his training. Yeo-Woon expressed his gratitude, assuring his teacher that he would not fail him. Sub-Meng simply replied that he should not, maintaining his composed demeanor. Sub-Meng then turned his gaze toward the blade resting nearby. Raising his hand, he channeled his internal energy and the sword responded instantly, flying into his grasp as though pulled by an invisible force. He unsheathed the weapon with a smooth motion and threw it toward Yeo-Woon. Yeo-Woon caught it by the hilt, immediately feeling its balance. The blade felt surprisingly light in his hand. Sub-Meng explained that ordinary swords typically weighed around 2 to 3 pounds, but the bright martial sword, an invaluable weapon belonging to their clan, was crafted to weigh only 1.5 pounds. Yeo-Woon remarked that its lightness must have been intentional, suited for the butterfly technique. Sub-Meng acknowledged his insight, noting that Yeo-Woon's understanding was quick and precise. To demonstrate, Sub-Meng swung the blade toward the corner of the bed. The motion seemed effortless, yet the strike was sharp enough to slice off a clean piece of wood. Yeo-Woon picked up the severed fragment, examining the clean edge where it had been cut, and noted the sword's remarkable sharpness. Sub-Meng confirmed this, explaining that even though the sword's range and weight were limited, its construction from refined metal granted it exceptional sharpness and durability, qualities that justified its esteemed reputation. He then instructed Yeo-Woon to step back. With a steady stance, Sub-Meng prepared to demonstrate what his student had long been eager to witness: the butterfly technique itself. Yeo-Woon silently commanded Nano to begin scanning. At once, the mechanical voice within him confirmed the order, initiating the scan in synchronization with Sub-Meng's movements. The sky gradually brightened as dawn approached, and a dense fog settled across the training grounds. Through the mist, a lone figure could be seen sprinting swiftly across the open field, using a refined movement technique. It was Submeng, the Crazy Blade. Having leapt out from the medical room in the main building, he was now departing the premises at great speed. From the roof above, two figures observed his departure: Left Guardian Lee Hameng and Great Guardian Markham. Hameng remarked that the Right Guardian was finally leaving, referring to him with thinly veiled disdain. Markham commended him for allowing Submeng to go without interference. Hameng responded that he had only followed Markham's orders, adding that he was relieved not to see Submeng roaming the halls any longer. He muttered that he would have to assign guards once more to patrol the second floor hallways, as the rest period for them was clearly over. Markham turned to leave, but Hameng called out to him, questioning why the Great Guardian had taken such an interest in the Seventh Prince. Markham paused briefly before replying that it was simply for the sake of fairness. Hameng shook his head lightly, finding the reasoning curious. He remarked that Markham seemed to believe all candidates deserved an equal chance. Markham only cautioned him not to question the will behind his actions before disappearing in an instant, leaving no trace behind. Hameng brushed the dust from his shoulder and sighed. He acknowledged Markham's speed and skill, thinking that as expected of one known as the Wind God, he could vanish at any moment if he wished. Watching the empty roof where Markham had stood, Hameng muttered to himself, wondering whether 2 weeks would truly be enough to restore fairness within the academy. As the morning session began, Yeo-Woon remained in bed instead of being awake as usual. Dr. Jungmeng entered the room and noticed the unusual sight. He found it odd, as Yeo-Woon was always up and active by the time he arrived. He wondered what could have caused the boy to sleep in, but then concluded that it was his final day to rest peacefully. Once Yeo-Woon returned to the group, his days would be filled with relentless training, hardship, and exhaustion. Believing it was best for him to get as much rest as possible, Jungmeng let him be. However, contrary to the doctor's assumption, Yeo-Woon's body was undergoing an intense internal transformation. Inside him, Nano was executing a complete reconstruction process. The system reported that muscle fiber alteration for simulating the dancing butterfly technique had reached 80% completion, while blood vessel alteration stood at 75%. The estimated time for total completion was 1 hour. An hour later, Jungmeng, seated at his desk, had dozed off from the quiet atmosphere. Suddenly, a loud groan startled him awake. He turned toward the sound to find Yeo-Woon awake and vomiting violently onto the floor. Alarmed, Jungmeng rushed to him and asked if he was all right, his tone filled with concern. He supported Yeo-Woon and gently patted his back, urging him to let it out. After helping him settle, he guided Yeo-Woon back into bed. Once Yeo-Woon drifted off to sleep again, Jungmeng checked his pulse, and his eyes widened in shock. The rhythm was fast and strong, far too intense for someone who had been sleeping moments ago. It resembled the pulse of a person who had just finished heavy physical training. He could not make sense of it. Moments later, Yeo-Woon's breathing steadied and his pulse returned to normal. His expression softened as he fell into a peaceful sleep once more. Jungmeng remained by his side, puzzled and uneasy. He could not comprehend what had just occurred or how Yeo-Woon's body had gone through such drastic strain without any visible cause. Internally, he was baffled. Nothing in his medical training, nor anything taught by physician Bake, could explain such a recovery. With a sigh, he decided to let the matter go, reasoning that since it was nearly lunchtime, he might as well let Yeo-Woon rest and eat something himself. About an hour later, shortly before lunch ended, Yeo-Woon slowly opened his eyes. He rose from his bed, excitement filling his expression, and clenched his fists. The power flowing through his body was far beyond what it had been just hours earlier. He could clearly sense how much his strength and control had evolved. Yeo-Woon thought about his teacher, Submeng, realizing now how much discipline and refinement his master's training had required. The difference between an untrained body and one molded through years of martial cultivation was unmistakable. A faint smile appeared on his face as he imagined Submeng's reaction. If the man learned that Yeo-Woon had reached this state within a few hours, he would likely be too stunned to believe it. Yeo-Woon then recalled Submeng's movements from their last session. Even without holding a sword, Submeng's hand had mimicked one perfectly, slicing through the air with incredible sharpness. The motion alone had created a blast of wind powerful enough to shake Yeo-Woon's stance. Inwardly, he realized with awe that Submeng had not even used internal energy for that display. The power came purely from the precision of form and speed. He immediately asked Nano whether the demonstration had been recorded. Nano confirmed that the entire sequence had been scanned and stored. Yeo-Woon then recalled Submeng's words during their final lesson. His teacher had sheathed his blade after the demonstration and told Yeo-Woon that it was unfortunate their time had ended so soon. He had still intended to teach him about codified fighting forms, but expressed confidence that Yeo-Woon's talent would allow him to master the dancing butterfly technique on his own own through observation. Yeo-Woon had bowed deeply in gratitude, thanking his teacher for all that he had learned. Sub-Meng had reminded him to continue training without hesitation, and to remain steadfast once he returned to the academy, warning that the challenges ahead would be severe. Yeo-Woon had silently vowed to uphold those words, determined never to give up no matter how difficult the path became. As Sub-Meng departed, Yeo-Woon stood quietly, watching his teacher disappear from sight. A faint thought crossed his mind. At least there was one person within the academy who was truly on his side. The feeling brought him a rare sense of reassurance. He silently promised himself that he would not let his teacher down. Turning inward, he called out to Nano and asked whether the analysis of Sub-Meng's movements had been completed. Nano confirmed that the scan was finished and reported that, based on the data, it would take approximately 6 hours to alter Yeo-Woon's muscle fibers and blood vessels to reach the same level as the scan target, Sub-Meng. The duration surprised Yeo-Woon. 6 hours felt longer than he expected, but he accepted it without question. Later, after the internal reconstruction was complete, his body began to move instinctively. His arm sliced through the air with speed and precision, his hand cutting a clean path just as Sub-Meng's had. Yeo-Woon realized with astonishment that his speed now matched his teacher's. He had only performed the first codified form of the dancing butterfly technique, yet it was identical in rhythm and execution. Excitement surged through him as he prepared to transition into the second formation, but the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. He immediately halted his movement. Without realizing it, his senses had heightened along with his physical strength. The subtle noise had reached him clearly from a distance. Lowering his stance, he glanced at his palm and muttered softly that he was prepared. The door opened and Dr. Jong-Meng stepped in. He looked surprised to see Yeo-Woon standing in the middle of the room and asked when he had awakened. Startled, Yeo-Woon felt slightly embarrassed and explained that he had simply been preparing to return to the academy. After composing himself, he put on his martial arts uniform and attached the tag marked with the red number 7. Jong-Meng let out a light sigh, remarking that the room would feel empty without him. Despite his expectation of tending to numerous patients, the infirmary had remained quiet during Yeo-Woon's stay. Yeo-Woon smiled faintly and told him that the peace would not last long, assuring the doctor that he would soon have plenty of patients to look after once training resumed. Jong-Meng smiled faintly and replied that he hoped Yeo-Woon was right, though he quickly corrected himself, saying it was actually better if the academy continued to have no patients at all. Yeo-Woon thanked him sincerely for taking care of him throughout his stay. Jong-Meng responded that it had been his duty and wished him good fortune, reminding him that things would only become more difficult from that point onward. After Yeo-Woon left the infirmary, Jong-Meng leaned back in his chair, muttering to himself that he now had nothing left to do and might as well take a nap. Outside the door, Yeo-Woon paused for a moment. He thought to himself that if Dr. Jong-Meng had not turned a blind eye to Sub-Meng's secret lessons, his time in the infirmary would have been far more difficult. He silently expressed his gratitude, promising that he would not forget the doctor's quiet kindness. With a faint smile, he recalled Jong-Meng's earlier wish for more patience, and mused that he would likely get them soon enough. Later that afternoon, at the Great Drill Hall of the Demonic Academy, the cadets assembled for group formation training. The large grounds buzzed with energy as students gathered in their respective groups, preparing for practice. Among them, all members of the 8th group turned their attention in one direction as a familiar figure approached. Chun Mukum's lips twisted into a cold smile when he saw who it was. Yeo-Woon had finally returned after 2 weeks. Instructor Impyong stepped forward, acknowledging Yeo-Woon's presence with calm professionalism. He greeted him and asked about his recovery. Yeo-Woon bowed respectfully and replied that he was completely healed. Impyong nodded in approval, pleased by the response. He reminded Yeo-Woon that the group had only covered theoretical lessons during his absence, and asked if he still remembered his position within the formation. Yeo-Woon bowed again, confirming that he did. Satisfied, Impyong handed him a sword and shield, instructing him to take his place among the formation lines to resume training with the rest of the cadets. Mukum scowled as Yeo-Woon approached, his voice rising in mockery. He began to insult him, calling him a coward and preparing to continue, but Yeo-Woon paid him no attention. Without even glancing his way, Yeo-Woon ran straight past him toward his position in formation. Mukum stood frozen, momentarily taken aback. Something about Yeo-Woon's demeanor felt different. There was no trace of hesitation or fear in his expression. Yeo-Woon, however, kept his thoughts to himself. It was not yet time to retaliate. Instructor Impyong's voice broke the tension as he raised his hand and signaled the start of training. He ordered everyone to maintain distance, warning that any further accidents would lead to expulsion from the academy. The cadets responded loudly in unison, affirming his command, and the session began. Impyong waved the flag, and the groups dispersed across the field, running into their designated formations. From his position, Impyong watched carefully. He noted that while Mukum was proud and ruthless, he managed his group with discipline and authority, qualities fitting of someone from a powerful clan and a candidate for minor priesthood. His concern, however, rested on Yeo-Woon. He had deliberately placed him in a position that required minimal movement, hoping to reduce the chance of error. Yet, as his gaze drifted to Yeo-Woon's section, Impyong's expression changed slightly. Yeo-Woon was moving seamlessly within formation. His timing, coordination, and stance were far better than expected. It appeared as though he had carefully studied his group members' rhythm and adjusted himself perfectly to match their flow. Instructor Impyong shouted across the training field, his voice firm and commanding. He ordered the cadets to hold their shields steady, maintain their formation, and keep their stances locked in place. He praised their progress, but warned them not to move until he gave the next command. 15 minutes passed as the students held their positions, the tension of the exercise weighing on their bodies. Impyong's tone hardened immediately as he demanded to know who had moved without permission. His voice carried across the field as he reminded them that such lack of discipline would never allow them to defeat the other groups in the upcoming second examination. He urged them to stay focused and alert. As his eyes swept over the students, Impyong's attention lingered on Yeo-Woon. He found himself puzzled. Many of the cadets before him had been training continuously for weeks, yet Yeo-Woon, who had only just returned from the infirmary, was performing flawlessly among them. His posture, timing, and balance showed no trace of weakness. It was as though he had never missed a single day of training. Impyong silently noted that he would need to observe Yeo-Woon more closely. Raising the flag once again, Impyong signaled the next command. The students quickly shifted their positions as he called for a half-moon formation to surround the enemy. He instructed them to advance in half steps, then in larger steps. The cadets followed perfectly, their movement synchronized, closing in without breaking formation. Yeo-Woon remained at the front, his gaze steady and body unwavering. Despite the intense drills, he showed no sign of fatigue. Watching him, Mukum's frustration grew. He cursed inwardly, enraged that Yeo-Woon continued to perform without a single mistake. He could not bear the thought of someone from a lesser lineage outshining him. Through telepathy, Mukum reached out to Jae-hun and instructed him to nod if he could hear him. Jae-hun responded with a slight movement of his head. Mukum then gave a second order, telling him to act during the third formation. Jae-hun smiled faintly and nodded again, understanding the unspoken command. After some time, Impyong raised the blue flag to begin the third formation. It was the most difficult sequence, requiring cadets to lock their shields together and thrust their swords through the narrow openings to form a tight defensive wall. Yeo-Woon observed the arrangement calmly. To him, the sequence felt natural. Internally, he realized that Nano had already implanted a perfect visual simulation of the formation into his mind, allowing his body to move with ease. Yeo-Woon stood positioned in the center of the shield formation, maintaining his stance with focus and composure. Behind him was Jae-hun, whose task was to thrust his sword forward through the gaps between the shields. Jae-hun's eyes narrowed with malice as he smirked to himself. He stared at Yeo-Woon's back, a cruel thought forming in his mind. Channeling internal energy into his leg, he prepared to deliver a powerful concealed kick meant to trip and humiliate Yeo-Woon. In his mind, he mocked him, believing that lowborns were meant to crawl rather than stand beside nobles. To avoid alerting the instructor, Jae-hun made no sound. He quietly placed his foot against Yeo-Woon's lower back, pressing down in preparation. Yeo-Woon sensed the pressure immediately and turned his head slightly. His gaze shifted downward, then up, meeting Jae-hoon's eyes. The sudden eye contact sent a chill down Jae-hun's spine. Panic briefly overtook him. For a moment, he thought Yeo-Woon had already anticipated his move. His expression twisted with frustration and anger, and he decided to strike with full force, channeling all of his internal energy into the kick. But the moment his foot connected, a shockwave erupted. A barrier of energy formed around Yeo-Woon's lower back, repelling the attack entirely. The force rebounded, launching Jae-hun backward as though he had been struck by his own power. A sharp cry escaped him as his body flew through the air and crashed onto the ground. He rolled across the dirt before coming to a stop, dazed and unable to comprehend what had just happened. Mukum turned his head sharply, his eyes widening in disbelief. The scene before him made no sense. Jae-hun had clearly been the one attacking, yet he was the one who had suffered the recoil. Lying flat on the ground, Jae-hun's mind raced in confusion. He questioned how Yeo-Woon could have possibly countered his attack. The idea that Yeo-Woon's internal energy might be stronger than his own seemed impossible. Yet the pain in his leg and the impact on his body told him otherwise. As he struggled to move, a shadow fell over him. Looking up, Jae-hun saw Instructor Impyong standing above him, frowning in irritation. Recognizing the instructor's face, Jae-hun's body stiffened. He tried to stand, but a sharp surge of pain shot through his foot, forcing him back down. Impyong glared at him, clearly displeased. Yeo-Woon glanced over his shoulder, a faint smirk forming at the corner of his lips. The satisfaction in his eyes was clear. Jae-hun, still on the ground, felt his anger boil over. Rage filled his mind as he glared up at Yeo-Woon, furious that someone of lower status dared to mock him even with a single look. Before he could speak, Instructor Impyong's sharp voice cut through the tension. He scolded Jae-hun sternly, warning him to fix his expression and pull himself together. Jae-hun tried to protest in desperation, insisting that it had been Yeo-Woon's fault, fumbling for an excuse about Yeo-Woon's position during the formation. Impyong's expression darkened at the absurd claim. The instructor drew his wooden club without hesitation and struck Jae-hun hard in the stomach, sending him doubling over in pain. His tone was filled with controlled fury as he reprimanded him, demanding to know what was wrong with him. Impyong reminded him that he had also been responsible for stabbing the 23rd cadet from behind during a previous incident. As punishment, Impyong declared that Jae-hun would lose all free time for the next 3 days and would undergo additional training with him until bedtime. When Jae-hun opened his mouth again, attempting to explain himself, Impyong silenced him with a cold glare that made him freeze. His voice turned low and threatening as he asked whether Jae-hun intended to offer yet another excuse. Terrified, Jae-hun immediately straightened himself and shouted the Academy's formal acknowledgement, "Mado," admitting his fault without further protest. Around them, whispers rippled through the cadets. Many mocked him under their breath, calling him a fool for trying to curry favor with Mukum by doing his dirty work. They said it was only fitting that his scheming had backfired so publicly. From among the students, the faint sound of teeth grinding broke the murmurs. Chun Mukum's jaw was clenched tightly, his eyes burning with anger. From the rooftop, Fire King Lee Ha-meng watched the training and noted Yeo-Won's unexpectedly potent internal power. He acknowledged Yeo-Won's connection to Sub-meng, the right guardian and royal bodyguard, but still found the display puzzling. The bald cadet should have gained at least 30 years worth of Nagong from the demonic dragon marble, yet Yeo-Won's power appeared to rival or even exceed that. Ha-meng considered the possibility that Yeo-Won's body was uniquely suited to absorb the marble's energy, or that his mixed bloodline still carried formidable strength. He recognized the brewing tension between young masters in the same group and anticipated that the contest for the minor priesthood would grow more interesting. When afternoon practice ended, all the students crowded into the large cafeteria for dinner. Yeo-Won welcomed the change from 2 weeks of plain rice soup and recognized with pleasure the soy sauce chicken before him. He savored the taste and allowed himself a private moment of satisfaction. At the same time, he noticed Mukum's hostile glare and resolved not to be swayed. Memories of helplessness at his mother's death fueled his determination. He felt no intention of forgiving Mukum or the other six sects and vowed quietly that the balance would shift and that he would be the one to trample those who had looked down on him. Instructor Impyong dismissed everyone after dinner, excusing all but Jae-hun. Jae-hun lingered with a frown and then followed Impyong back toward the dormitory building. Yeo-Won scoffed quietly as he watched Jae-hun being led away, then turned his attention toward his own quarters. He recalled the group's room placement. Group 8 occupied room 8 on the first floor and noted it easily in his mind. Just as he was about to enter, a familiar, grating voice stopped him. Chun Mukum stood behind him with his arms crossed, wearing a smug expression. Yeo-Won turned slowly, already expecting this encounter. Internally, he felt no surprise. Mukum had a habit of asserting dominance wherever he went, always surrounded by his followers. To Yeo-Won, it was nothing more than another act of arrogance. Their presence soon drew attention. Students from nearby rooms began to gather in the hallway, whispering among themselves as they realized what was happening. A confrontation between the rumored 7th Prince and Chun Mukum of the Loyal Clan. Among the crowd, young Master Wonryu of the musician sect happened to pass by. Her gaze lingered briefly on the standoff, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Mukum, noticing the attention, found satisfaction in the opportunity. He intended to use this moment to humiliate Yeo-Won in front of everyone. He stepped closer, his tone dripping with disdain. He mocked Yeo-Won's heritage, sneering that someone of lowly birth must have enjoyed hiding in the infirmary rather than facing real challenges. Yeo-Won, unfazed, met his glare steadily. His voice remained calm and composed as he asked if Mukum was insulting his holiness by speaking that way. The words caught Mukum off guard. Confusion crossed his face as he stammered in response. Yeo-Won continued, explaining that by calling his bloodline lowly, Mukum was indirectly insulting the patriarch himself, the one whose blood ran through him. The color drained slightly from Mukum's face as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Every student present was loyal to the Lord, and Yeo-Won's pointed remark had turned their attention sharply toward Mukum. The tension thickened as quiet whispers spread, questioning whether Mukum's insult had indeed crossed the line. Mukum clenched his teeth, his expression twisting as he struggled to recover. He tried to speak, insisting that his words had been misunderstood, but the murmurs around him only grew louder. Inside, his fury boiled. This confrontation was meant to humiliate Yeo-Won before everyone, yet somehow the tables had turned, and now he was the one being scorned. From a short distance, Chun Won-ryu of the musician sect let out a sharp scoff, muttering that the loyal clan was full of fools. Nearby, Chun Kung-won of the sword clan stopped briefly to observe the scene, shaking his head in silent disapproval. Overwhelmed by frustration, Mukum grabbed Yeo-Won by the collar, his voice rising with anger as he threatened to tear him apart for his insolence. But before he could finish the sentence, Yeo-Won's body moved in a blur. Bam! Yeo-Won's fist drove straight into Mukum's face, the force sending him reeling backward as blood burst from his nose. With a smug grin, Yeo-Won remarked that Mukum's voice was a bit faint, probably buried under the sound of that hit. Mukum roared with rage, screaming at Yeo-Won and calling him a filthy vermin. His fury ignited as he unleashed the loyal demon fist formation. He struck out in blind rage, but before the blow could land, Yeo-Won's figure vanished like a wisp of smoke. Gasps rippled through the gathered cadets as they tried to follow his movements. They realized Yeo-Won had used an advanced agility technique. None of them could comprehend how someone anyone like him, someone supposedly untrained, could move with such speed. Mukum shouted furiously, ordering his subordinates to chase after him. At his command, several cadets from the loyal clan sprinted after Yeo-Woon, who was already heading toward the forest behind the dormitory building. Mukum fumed as he chased after Yeo-Woon through the trees, furious that the boy had struck him first and then fled. He resolved to make Yeo-Woon pay for the humiliation. The pursuers strained to keep up, but Yeo-Woon kept a steady distance that suggested he might be drawing them deeper into the woods. One of the cadets wondered if they were being lured. The thought passed through the group as they matched Yeo-Woon's pace. Mukum barked orders, losing patience with his men and deciding to pursue Yeo-Woon himself. He wiped the blood from his nose and surged ahead, determined to catch the boy and break him. Anger fueled him as he imagined crushing Yeo-Woon until nothing remained of him. Yeo-Woon halted and turned when Mukum closed the gap. He deliberately kept his distance and then revealed, with a controlled movement, that he had led Mukum into the clearing. Yeo-Woon's body coiled and then sprung forward. His palm struck with focused force. Mukum met the blow with both fists, managing to block, but the impact pushed him back 2 steps. He staggered, shocked by the power behind the strike and by the level of skill Yeo-Woon displayed. He struggled to reconcile what he had seen. A defensive 7-star technique had still been overwhelmed, and the speed Yeo-Woon had shown earlier now made sense as part of a larger skill set. Inside, Mukum realized his assessment had been wrong. Yeo-Woon watched Mukum's confusion with a satisfied grin, sensing that his opponent was losing composure exactly as he had planned. Mukum's followers arrived just as the fight reached its peak. Yeo-Woon moved first. His body twisted sharply, and with fluid precision he unleashed the second formation of the butterfly blade dance. But Mukum reacted instantly. With a sharp movement, he dodged the attack entirely. Yeo-Woon's eyes widened in brief surprise. He had expected that strike to end the fight. Before he could recover, Mukum lunged forward. His fist glowed faintly with focused energy as he struck Yeo-Woon's chest using the third formation of the Loyal Demon Fist. The blow landed squarely, forcing a painful grunt from Yeo-Woon. He bent backward just in time to evade the follow-up strike, but Mukum pressed on relentlessly. Driving his elbow upward, Mukum slammed it into Yeo-Woon's right shoulder. Yeo-Woon raised his arm to block, but the impact was too powerful. The force sent him staggering backward, his feet scraping across the dirt as he regained balance. Inwardly, Yeo-Woon acknowledged the difference between them. His internal energy was still not enough to match Mukum's. Even before entering the academy, Mukum had possessed greater strength, and after consuming the demonic dragon marble, his power had only grown. Still, Yeo-Woon steadied himself. He could not back down. He reminded himself that as long as he kept the momentum, he could deny Mukum any opportunity to strike back. Gathering his energy, Yeo-Woon launched forward again. His movements became swift and unpredictable, his hands cutting through the air with such speed that they left behind shimmering traces resembling butterfly wings. Each motion flowed into the next. His strikes aimed directly at Mukum's right shoulder. The spectators gasped in disbelief. Several cadets whispered among themselves, stunned that Yeo-Woon had produced a shadow image, a technique reserved for highly advanced practitioners. Mukum's eyes widened for an instant, but he quickly regained composure. He stepped aside with calculated precision, narrowly avoiding Yeo-Woon's strike, and retaliated with a sudden upward kick. His heel connected squarely with Yeo-Woon's head. The impact was brutal. Yeo-Woon's body was lifted off the ground and thrown several feet back before crashing down heavily. Dust rose around him as he slid to a stop. Mukum stepped forward, his expression filled with contempt as he looked down at Yeo-Woon. He acknowledged that Yeo-Woon might have mastered the codified forms of combat, but mocked him for lacking the practical skill to counter real attacks. Yeo-Woon pushed himself up, still reeling from the blow. His thoughts raced. He had expected Mukum to rely solely on punches, but that sudden kick had completely caught him off guard. Mukum continued his taunt, his voice dripping with arrogance. He admitted that Yeo-Woon's use of an advanced technique had startled him, but claimed it was obvious that the movements were learned hastily. He sneered, saying that Yeo-Woon was nothing more than an imitator who had no true understanding of his limits. Yeo-Woon steadied his trembling arms as he stood, realizing that Mukum had seen through him. The fight had exposed the truth. His forms were flawless in structure, but they lacked the natural flow of experience. He silently acknowledged that he had underestimated Mukum and that real battle experience created a gap far greater than he had imagined. Mukum clenched his fist, declaring that he would find out later how Yeo-Woon had managed to learn such techniques. For now, he intended to crush him completely. He charged forward, his body lowering into a stance. It was the 5th codified fighting form of the loyal clan's Fist of Stealth, Crouching Tiger Barrage. Yeo-Woon's mind raced frantically as Mukum closed the distance. He searched for a response, a way to block or evade the oncoming assault. Before he could decide, Nano's voice resonated in his mind. Nano detected imminent danger from a hostile source. It activated an augmented reality overlay within Yeo-Woon's vision and engaged battle tutorial mode to guide his defense. A faint shimmer of light flickered in Yeo-Woon's eyes as the system synchronized with his perception. Time seemed to slow. Mukum's fist shot forward, fast as lightning, cutting through the air just past Yeo-Woon's chin. Instinct took over. Yeo-Woon's body shifted to the side, his movement smooth smooth and controlled, his form gliding past the attack like a shadow. Without hesitation, he countered, bam! His left fist arced upward in a clean motion and struck directly beneath Mukum's chin. The impact resounded sharply, blood sprayed as Mukum's head snapped back, and a raw cry escaped him. He stumbled, reeling from the unexpected force of the strike. Yeo-Woon stood frozen for a moment, staring at his own hand in disbelief. His heart pounded, his mind struggling to process what had happened. Inside, he thought in shock. What he had just done wasn't part of any technique he had learned. Nano's voice echoed within Yeo-Woon's mind, informing him that a temporary self-defense tutorial had been activated. The program it selected was identified as boxing. Yeo-Woon questioned the term, and Nano explained that it referred to a form of guided instruction. It had analyzed Mukum's movements in intervals of 0.01 seconds to calculate the optimal defense strategy. Yeo-Woon frowned slightly at the complex explanation, but understood the essence of it. Ignoring the technical language, he focused on the core idea. The technique was called boxing. He then asked if it was possible to use the dancing butterfly technique instead. Nano confirmed that the analysis and transfer of the dancing butterfly technique had already been completed, making it fully usable. It then asked for Yeo-Woon's confirmation to proceed. Yeo-Woon's lips curved into a faint grin, and he gave his answer. Across from him, Mukum's frustration grew. His anger twisted into open contempt as he mocked Yeo-Woon, accusing him of having picked up random punching tricks. With renewed rage, he declared that Yeo-Woon's luck had run out and charged forward again. At that moment, Nano's voice returned, announcing the change. The active defense tutorial was now switching from boxing to the dancing butterfly technique. Mukum unleashed a flurry of punches, each one faster than the last, but Yeo-Woon, wearing a faint smile, could see every strike before it landed. His body moved with calm precision, evading every swing without effort. Shock spread through Mukum as he realized that all his punches had missed. Yeo-Woon countered instantly, his movements sharp and fluid as he unleashed a powerful blade strike. Multiple blows landed across Mukum's body in rapid succession, each one clean and decisive. As the impact rippled through him, dread filled Mukum's mind. Memories he had buried deep began to surface, and the voices of the past echoed within him. Accusations and hatred filled his thoughts. Voices blaming him for weakness, condemning him for things he could not change. His mother, Lady Jai, came to mind. She had been married to Lord Cheon Yeo-Woon through the Oath of the Six Clans, a union bound by duty rather than affection. Though she had loved the Lord deeply and sought his attention, his heart had always belonged to a servant woman within the palace. That betrayal had driven Lady Jia into despair and madness. Her last words, filled with sorrow and rage, still haunted him. In his final memory of her, she had grasped her son's throat with trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably as she cursed his existence. The painful recollection pierced through him, and confusion struck as he wondered why that memory had resurfaced now, in the middle of battle. As the memory returned, all that remained within Mukum was hatred. Every trace of pain, confusion, and sorrow turned into pure resentment toward one person. His teeth clenched, his eyes burned with fury, and he lunged forward, throwing a fist straight at Yeo-Woon's face. Yeo-Woon shifted slightly, tilting his head to the side. In the same motion, his hand shot out and seized Mukum's head firmly in his grasp. With a swift, powerful motion, he drove it straight into the ground. The impact thundered through the clearing as dirt burst into the air. Mukum's body jerked violently, and blood spilled from his mouth as he gasped for breath. His body trembled, his voice breaking as he tried to speak through pain and disbelief, refusing to accept what had just happened. Yeo-Woon stood above him. His gaze carried no sympathy, no hesitation, only finality. Mukum struggled to speak, choking out words of defiance, but Yeo-Woon's voice cut through the air like a blade. He told him that he had brought it upon himself. Mukum's defeat left the surrounding students frozen in disbelief. The boy who, only 2 weeks earlier, had possessed no internal energy now stood victorious, displaying martial skill that far surpassed their own. Yeo-Woon turned toward them with a sharp glare. The students instinctively recoiled, shaking their heads when confronted, unwilling to challenge him. He ordered them to take Mukum away, and though fear lingered from what they had witnessed, they obeyed immediately. Despite Mukum's loss, none dared oppose the authority of the loyal clan. As Yeo-Woon watched them drag Mukum away, a thought crossed his mind. If he were to build his own following, would others someday fear him in the same way? Mukum, still dazed, shouted angrily for his subordinates to release him, insisting he could walk on his own. They hesitated, addressing him as prince, but he snapped at them to stop and not make him repeat himself. Turning to Yeo-Woon, his voice was filled with bitterness. He demanded to know why Yeo-Woon had spared him, why he hadn't finished the fight completely. Yeo-Woon's tone remained calm as he told him that if it weren't for their need to cooperate in the upcoming second examination, Mukum's head would already have been split in two. Mukum Mukum spat in anger, cursing him and calling his words nothing but a pathetic excuse. Yeo-Woon's eyes narrowed as he warned him to keep talking and find out what would happen next. Mukum shouted back, trying to provoke him further, but Yeo-Woon dismissed him coldly, remarking that he could barely stand. As Mukum began another insult, Yeo-Woon turned away, cutting him off mid-sentence. Without another word, his figure disappeared from sight, swift as the wind. Mukum remained standing in silence, his teeth clenched in frustration as he cursed under his breath. Meanwhile, on his way back, Yeo-Woon's expression showed no sign of satisfaction. The victory had been too close for comfort. Inwardly, he admitted that without Nano's intervention, he would have lost. His advantage in learning martial arts quickly was undeniable, yet he understood that no amount of memorization could replace real combat experience. He reflected on his training, the codified fighting forms of the dancing butterfly technique, the flawless postures, and the sharp execution. Even with perfect mastery of movement, he knew he still stood far below Submang's level. To reach true strength, he needed not only more experience, but far greater internal power. But there was no time for comfort. The other 6 sects would undoubtedly target him while he trained. He needed to be ready to use everything he had at his disposal with complete efficiency. Calling out to Nano, he began to assess his current state. Nano responded instantly. When asked how much of its capability had been used, it reported that only 3% of the nanomachine's functions had been accessed so far. Yeo-Woon froze for a moment in surprise. 3%. That was all he had been utilizing. Nano elaborated, explaining that out of 100 portions of its full potential, only 3 had been used. No user in history, it added, had ever exceeded 30% of total functionality. Hearing that, Yeo-Woon's mind steadied. If there was still so much untapped power, then the path ahead was wider than he had imagined. He ordered Nano to explain its complete range of possible uses in detail. Nano complied. It informed him that it would begin transferring the user manual of the Generation 7 nanomachine directly into his brain. Yeo-Woon confirmed his consent, and the process began. Nano informed Yeo-Woon that, in addition to the user manual, it would transfer a registry of technical terms to help him comprehend the data more effectively. Yeo-Woon realized it referred to the unfamiliar words Nano often used and confirmed the request. Nano acknowledged the command and began the transfer of the Generation 7 nanomachine's full user manual, along with the registry of technical terms directly into Yeo-Woon's brain. The process took time. Waves of data streamed through his mind, and though the volume of information was immense, Yeo-Woon endured it steadily. When the transfer completed, there was no pain, only slight dizziness that soon faded. As his thoughts cleared, Yeo-Woon began sorting through the information now embedded within him. The range of Nano's capabilities was astonishing, far beyond anything he had imagined. Among its features, several functions stood out, each designed to compensate for his lack of combat experience. One of them was a repeated simulation ability that could reproduce battles within augmented reality. He confirmed the concept internally, realizing that he could now simulate fighting opponents virtually to strengthen his skills. Nano then explained that to activate the simulation system, motion analysis data of the opponent was required. Yeo-Woon immediately asked if it could be done using the data collected from his earlier fight with Mukum. Nano responded that while the current analysis was incomplete, it could still create a basic avatar of Mukum using the recorded battle patterns. Yeo-Woon accepted the limitation, noting it was unfortunate that more precise information wasn't yet available, but he decided to proceed regardless. He turned away from the main path and made his way to a secluded area where no one would interrupt him. With free time remaining before nightfall, he prepared to begin his first training session using Nano's simulation system. Nano activated the augmented reality and created an avatar for the battle simulation. Yeo-Woon watched in astonishment as the projection formed before him. Nano informed him that the avatar's actions required adjustment and prompted him to choose an impact percentage for the avatar's attacks. Yeo-Woon asked about the meaning of impact percentage and learned that it determined how much force the avatar's strikes would deal. Selecting 100% would recreate the real fight's impact exactly. He chose 100%. Nano confirmed the simulation activation at full impact. The avatar of Chun Mukum materialized, wearing a smug expression and hurling a verbal taunt. Yeo-Woon noted that the simulation even reproduced Mukum's nasty attitude. He considered the consequence. Because of the upcoming examination, he had not been able to finish Mukum in reality, but here, within the simulation, he could act freely. Yeo-Woon launched forward, striking first, and the avatar of Mukum immediately countered with the same attacks he had faced during their real battle. Remembering how he had avoided them before with Nano's guidance, Yeo-Woon stepped aside smoothly and moved in to deliver a butterfly blade dance strike. But just as his hand cut through the air, the avatar twisted unnaturally, dodging with the same unpredictability that Mukum once had. A sharp kick followed, landing squarely in Yeo-Woon's stomach. Pain exploded through his body as he fell to the ground, clutching his abdomen. The sensation was shockingly real. Gasping, he muttered in disbelief relief at how vivid the pain felt. Nano responded immediately, explaining that the nanomachines inside his body had recreated the exact pain and impact data from the earlier fight to replicate realism in the simulation. It then asked if he wanted to lower the impact percentage. Yeo-Woon refused flatly and ordered to continue. The avatar taunted him again, gesturing with its fingers and calling him out. Yeo-Woon clenched his teeth in anger. Despite knowing it was only a virtual projection, the familiar mockery ignited his frustration. He lunged forward once more, channeling his anger into a refined series of blade strikes from the dancing butterfly technique. Hours passed in the augmented space as Yeo-Woon trained relentlessly, battling the simulated Murim over and over again. By the time the session ended, night had fallen. Yeo-Woon lay on his back, drenched in sweat, his breathing uneven. Though Nano had already healed the physical fatigue and strain from his body, exhaustion still lingered deep within him. Yeo-Woon asked Nano for the time, and it responded that it was around 10. He sat up, frustration clear on his face. Out of 15 simulated duels, he had only managed to win once. During the first battle, he had been defeated within 5 formations, unable to properly defend himself. The realization struck hard. His earlier claim about cracking Mukum's skull had been nothing but overconfidence. If the real Mukum had been before him, it would have been his own head shattered instead. Nano reassured him that progress would come with experience. It noted that his movements had become smoother after each fight, and that he was beginning to apply the correct formations of the dancing butterfly technique at precise moments. Yeo-Woon, however, remained unsatisfied. He argued that the avatar's ability was limited, capable of repeating only 3 codified forms and a handful of basic techniques, yet he had barely managed to defeat it even once. Despite his frustration, a determined grin crossed his face. He silently vowed that within a week he would be able to defeat Mukum's avatar without struggle. Moments later, Yeo-Woon arrived at the dormitory. When he entered the room assigned to the 8th group, silence filled the space. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Every student inside had already heard what had happened. Their quiet stares made it clear that the story of his fight had spread quickly. Yeo-Woon scanned the room to locate his bed, and before he could move, someone hurried toward him. It was the 23rd cadet, Hobom. He stopped in front of Yeo-Woon, bowed slightly, and pointed toward a nearby bed with both hands, guiding him with exaggerated politeness. The other students in the room exchanged confused glances. None of them could understand why Hobom, who had once been close to Mukum, was now behaving so submissively toward Yeo-Woon. Yeo-Woon observed him quietly and asked why he was acting so differently. He wondered aloud if Hobom expected something in return for his sudden change in attitude. Inside, Hobom was trembling. Having been completely cast aside by Mukum, he no longer had anywhere to turn. Desperation filled him, and he decided to take a gamble on the only person who had shown true strength. He fell to one knee before Yeo-Woon and clasped his hands together, lowering his head in a respectful bow. In a firm, trembling voice, he asked permission to serve him, declaring his intent to follow Yeo-Woon as his lord. The murmurs in the room grew louder. None of the students had expected such a scene. Even Yeo-Woon was taken aback. Though he had often imagined forming his own following, he hadn't expected someone to offer loyalty this soon. Hobom bowed deeply again, apologizing for his earlier behavior in the medical room and begging Yeo-Woon to accept him as his servant. Yeo-Woon stood still for a moment, deep in thought. Since childhood, he had never trusted anyone. Even guard Yang, who had protected him, had done so under orders from His Holiness. But now, this cadet was offering loyalty of his own free will. Hobom, still kneeling, looked up anxiously, hoping for an answer. When Yeo-Woon finally nodded with a faint grin, relief washed over him. He immediately bowed again, lowering his forehead to the ground in gratitude, his voice shaking with excitement as he vowed to serve Yeo-Woon forever. But before the moment could settle, a mocking voice broke through the room. Mukum had returned, his tone dripping with disdain. Standing beside him was Jae-hun, freshly returned from his additional training. Mukum sneered, laughing harshly at the sight before him, calling the display nothing but pathetic. Jae-hun's furious voice cut through the tension as he berated Hobom, calling him a spineless insect for pledging loyalty elsewhere. Hobom trembled at the sound of Mukum and Jae-hun's voices, but forced himself to remain composed. Fear clawed at his chest, yet he refused to show weakness before them. Yeo-Woon's gaze turned sharp and cold as he stepped forward. His tone carried no emotion as he reminded Jae-hun of his place, questioning how he dared to insult someone else's loyal follower. His words cut deep, labeling Jae-hun the true spineless one, a parasite surviving off Mukum's shadow. Jae-hun's face turned red with anger. His voice cracked as he stuttered back a response, but Yeo-Woon only chuckled, his calm mockery pushing him further into rage. Unable to hold back any longer, Jae-hun charged forward with a wild punch. Yeo-Woon barely moved, tilting his torso aside to let the blow pass before delivering a swift strike to the back of Jae-hun's neck. The sound of impact echoed through the dormitory. Jae-hun's body went limp, collapsing to the floor before sliding across the polished wooden boards, unconscious. Yeo-Woon straightened up, brushing off his sleeve. His voice was low and indifferent as he muttered that Jae-hun was nothing compared to the simulation he had trained against. Hobom, standing nearby, looked at him in awe. In that moment, he felt absolute certainty that he had made the right choice in pledging his loyalty. loyalty. At the doorway, Mukum stood silently glaring at Yeo-Woon. For the first time, he did not attack. He simply turned his head away, his voice calm yet bitter as he warned Yeo-Woon to enjoy his fleeting moment of triumph. Having a single follower would not change anything. Mukum turned and walked off, leaving behind a stunned silence. The other students whispered among themselves, struggling to process what they had just seen. None of them could believe that Mukum, the arrogant and vicious heir of the loyal clan, had backed down. Whispers filled the air. Uncertain yet reverent, many began to wonder if Cheon Yeo-Woon, the outcast prince once looked down upon, might one day rise to lead a new generation within the demonic cult. A week later, the day of the second examination arrived, and the great drill hall was filled with tension. Rows of cadets stood in formation under the sharp gaze of their instructors. Instructor Impyoung's voice echoed across the hall as he reminded the students that everything he had taught them had come to an end. Their performance now would depend entirely on their own skill and discipline. His final command was met with a unified shout of acknowledgement from the cadets. At the center of the hall, Left Guardian Lee Ha-meng stepped forward to oversee the proceedings. His tone was calm but carried authority as he announced that the examination would begin with a random draw. Just as explained earlier, 4 groups at a time would step forward to determine their opponents through a lottery. When the first 4 groups were called, the hall stirred with murmurs. Word spread quickly that several group leaders had changed. The second and third groups no longer had the same commanders as before. Only the first group, still led by Chun Mu-yeon of the Wise clan, and the fourth group, under Cadet 72, retained their original leaders. Ha-meng observed the changes with mild interest, but little surprise. Soon, the first set of matchups was drawn. Group 1 versus Group 3, and Group 2 versus Group 4. The hall erupted in cheers as excitement rippled through the crowd. Ha-meng raised his hand, calling for the next draw for leaders from the 5th to 8th groups to step forward. The next set of cadets walked up to the stage. Once again, whispers spread among the students as it became clear that 2 more groups had new leadership, but it was the final announcement that caught everyone's attention. Ha-meng's gaze fell on the 8th group's leader, and his expression shifted slightly. Until now, he had assumed that Prince Chun Mukum would still be leading the group, but standing there instead, holding the black tag numbered 7, was Cheon Yeo-Woon. Among those watching, Chun Won-ryu of the Sound Clan could not hide her astonishment. Won-ryu's thoughts burned with irritation as she remembered how often she had warned Mukum, only for him to ignore her every word. The fool had brought this upon himself. Her mind drifted back to her final exchange with Mukum the previous day. Near the end of the afternoon training session, the academy grounds were busy with preparation for the second examination. Many groups had gathered in open spaces to refine their formations and strategies. Mukum, confident in his own skills and the strength of his group, had already decided on a plan of attack earlier in the day. With his arrogance barely concealed, he dismissed his subordinates, criticizing the other groups as he did so. He muttered to himself that the others were only exposing their own tactics by practicing openly. Watching them train, he claimed, was unbearable. Instead of wasting time like them, he intended to focus on perfecting his personal techniques. As he turned to leave the training ground, a familiar voice called out to him. He glanced back and found Chun Won-ryu of the Sound Clan approaching. Mukum's face darkened the moment he saw her. His tone turned dismissive as he asked what she wanted. Won-ryu folded her arms and scolded him lightly, saying that when someone called his name, it was polite to respond. But Mukum was in no mood for either. He snapped at her to get to the point, irritation flaring in his voice. Won-ryu only sighed, pretending to be disappointed. She told him she had come out of good faith, intending to help him prepare for the examination, but if this was how he treated people trying to help, perhaps he didn't deserve it. Mukum's patience ran out. He turned sharply to walk away, his voice cold as he reminded her of her own words, the ones where she had once mocked the stealth sect as a clan of fools. Won-ryu let out a long, exasperated sigh and shook her head, muttering that she truly couldn't stand dealing with Mukum. Still, she decided to keep it brief and told him to listen carefully. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a strip of linen tightly wrapped around her arm. Mukum frowned at the sight and asked if she had been injured. She confirmed it, explaining that the wound had been sustained the previous night. When Mukum asked for clarification, she told him she had been training alone when she was suddenly ambushed. Mukum's expression shifted into disbelief. He scoffed, mocking the very idea that someone like her could be caught off guard, questioning who would dare to attack a member of the Sound Clan in such a reckless manner. Won-ryu's face hardened. She explained that her attacker had been wearing a mask, leaving her with no clue as to who they were. Mukum dismissed the matter arrogantly, claiming that being masked or not made no difference. What surprised him was that she had been careless enough to get attacked at all. Her patience snapped. She raised her voice, insisting that she had not lowered her guard for even a second. The ambush wasn't the result of carelessness. It had been a calculated move. Mukum folded his arms, clearly unimpressed, and asked if her only point was to tell him to be careful just because she had been attacked. Won-ryu shot him a glare, frustration clear in her tone. She told him he should listen, because if someone had targeted her, there was a high chance he would be next. The attacker wasn't random. They were coming after those who posed a threat in the upcoming examination. That caught Mukum's attention. He frowned slightly and asked what she meant, Wonryu reminded him of the procedure for the drawing that would determine which groups would face each other. 4 groups at a time were brought forward for the selection, not all at once. Mukum still didn't see the connection and told her to get to the point. Wonryu took a step closer and spoke firmly, urging him to think. By choosing 4 groups at a time, each set of teams could already predict which other groups they were likely to face. Mukum's expression darkened as he pieced the implication together. He realized that the purpose of revealing the draw order wasn't random, it was deliberate. The arrangement had given every group enough information to target their potential opponents before the examination even began. Wonryu nodded, satisfied that he had caught on. She explained that if a group's leader were incapacitated or eliminated beforehand, the rest of the team would fall into disarray. Without proper leadership, formations would crumble, and the group would stand little chance in battle. Before turning away, she gave him one final warning. The examination was tomorrow, and if he valued his position, he needed to stay alert. Training alone at night would only make him an easy target. As a candidate for the minor priesthood, she told him not to humiliate himself by failing the second round, or worse, by getting exiled from his own sect for carelessness. With that, Wonryu walked off into the night, leaving Mukum standing in silence. Mukum scowled, his pride wounded. He thought bitterly about how low he must have fallen to be receiving warnings from someone he considered the weakest among them. Yet, even through his irritation, her words lingered in his mind. Reluctantly, he admitted to himself that she had a point. It would be wiser to take precautions. He decided he would go find Jae-hun to discuss their strategy. But before he could take a single step, a faint sound came from behind him, the whisper of metal being drawn. The realization struck too late. An intruder stood in the shadows, unsheathing a blade with deadly intent. Elsewhere, near midnight, Yeo-Woon was finishing another grueling session of simulation training. Sweat rolled down his neck as he slowed his breathing. Nano informed him that the time was approximately 10 in the evening. Yeo-Woon asked for an update on his win rate against Mukum's combat avatar. The response came promptly. It stood at 60%. A hint of frustration crossed his face. He had been so confident that he would easily surpass the simulation within a week, yet his victories barely crossed half. Nano, however, reassured him that the improvement was significant. Out of 106 battles, Yeo-Woon's adaptability and mastery of the dancing butterfly technique had advanced rapidly. Given his rate of progress, the system calculated that a complete victory was not far off. Yeo-Woon let out a quiet sigh and asked if Nano was simply trying to console him, but the response was mechanical and calm, confirming that it was only a factual analysis. Accepting it with a smirk, Yeo-Woon decided to return to the dormitory for the night. As he made his way down the path through the dimly lit woods, a sharp sound suddenly echoed through the still air. A short guttural cry followed by the clash of steel. Instinctively, Yeo-Woon stopped and turned toward the direction of the noise. He sprinted through the trees, his senses sharpened, until he reached the scene. There in the darkness, he could barely make out 2 figures, one slumped motionless on the ground, the other locked in a desperate struggle against an unseen assailant. Unable to distinguish their faces, Yeo-Woon gave a silent command to Nano. The system immediately activated night vision mode, amplifying the faint light in the forest until the surroundings became clear as day. What he saw made him pause for an instant. The wounded man who was barely fending off the relentless attacker was none other than Cheon Mukum. The masked figure before him moved with deadly precision. His blade cut through the air with speed and weight, forcing Mukum back repeatedly. Blood already trailed down Mukum's right leg, his movement sluggish and unsteady. The masked man lunged forward again, his sword slicing past Mukum's neck by mere inches. Mukum barely managed to leap aside, but his balance faltered. His injured leg buckled beneath him, and he crashed to the ground, breath ragged. The assailant pressed forward to finish it, raising his sword to strike again. But before the blade could fall, Yeo-Woon's voice tore through the forest, commanding him to stop. Though Yeo-Woon despised Mukum, he couldn't allow the group's leader to be killed on the eve of the examination. Without hesitation, he charged in. The masked man reacted swiftly, spinning toward the new threat and swinging his blade. Yeo-Woon's enhanced sight read every motion. He ducked low beneath the strike and countered instantly. His hand moved with fluid precision as he delivered a sharp blow to the masked man's abdomen. The impact sent a deep reverberation through the air as the attacker staggered back, his footing momentarily lost in the dirt and shadows. Yeo-Woon steadied his stance, watching the figure carefully. His mind raced as he tried to read the man's next motion, but there was nothing predictable about it. Whoever this attacker was, his skill was undeniable. The masked man's gaze lingered on Yeo-Woon for a heartbeat, his eyes narrowing beneath the shadows of the mask. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the forest, his form swallowed by darkness. Yeo-Woon considered giving chase, but the sight before him changed his mind. Mukum lay on the ground, clutching his thigh, while another cadet lay beside him with blood matting his hair. Mukum let out a strained groan, his voice bitter even in weakness. He spat out words of resentment, cursing the fact that he had been saved by someone he considered beneath him. Yeo-Woon gave a faint, cold chuckle, remarking that if that was the case, he could simply leave him there. But despite his words, he couldn't ignore the condition of his fellow cadets. He brushed the thought aside and moved quickly, helping both Mukum and the injured student to their feet and leading leading them back toward the dormitory. When they arrived, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The sight of their group leader and another member in such critical condition struck every student with unease. Hobum hurried forward, his voice tight with concern as he asked if Yeo-Woon was hurt. Yeo-Woon assured him that he was fine, telling him not to worry. His attention then shifted to the second injured cadet, Jae-hun. Kneeling beside him, Yeo-Woon gently wiped the blood from his head before silently asking Nano to assess the wound. Nano's response came instantly. It detected a laceration approximately 4 centimeters long and 2 millimeters deep, caused by a blade. If the bleeding was stopped and the wound disinfected and stitched, there would be no serious consequences. Jae-hun's injury, while painful, was not life-threatening. Mukum's, however, was far worse. Blood continued to pour from his right thigh, staining the floor beneath him, and his face had grown alarmingly pale from loss of blood. Yeo-Won's voice cut through the tense silence as he turned sharply toward Hobum, ordering him to fetch the professor on night duty. Hobum immediately nodded, his voice stammering as he replied before sprinting out of the room. Within minutes, an instructor rushed in behind him. He knelt beside Mukum and began to examine the wound on his thigh. After several moments of treatment, the instructor's grim tone confirmed what everyone feared. Mukum would not be able to walk for some time. The color drained from Mukum's face. Wunru's warning echoed back at him, cruelly precise. He clenched his jaw, shame and fury twisting in his chest as the truth settled in. Around them, the other students whispered anxiously among themselves. The news spread like wildfire. If their leader couldn't even stand, their group's fate in the upcoming examination was sealed. The test was tomorrow, and without a functioning leader, their formation would collapse before it even began. The instructor finished dressing Mukum's wound, and with practiced ease, he lifted the cadet onto his shoulder, instructing the others to rest for the night while he took the injured student to the infirmary. As the instructor left, Yeo-Woon noticed that there was another injured student who needed attention. Hobum immediately offered to carry Jae-hun himself, but Yeo-Woon stopped him. He said he would take him to the infirmary himself. Mukum was carried out by the instructor for further treatment, leaving the dorm quiet but tense. Yeo-Woon called out to stop the instructor before he could leave, pointing to the other unconscious cadet lying nearby. He reminded the professor that while Mukum's condition was severe, student 80 Jae-hun also had a head wound that required medical attention. The instructor paused, glancing back over his shoulder. His tone was calm but edged with dry amusement as he replied that he had already expected one of them to think of that. When Yeo-Woon asked if that had been deliberate, the man gave a faint, knowing smile and told him he wasn't as clueless as he looked. When Yeo-Woon pressed for an explanation, the professor dismissed it casually. He said there was no particular reason, only that their group seemed unusually anxious about failing the upcoming examination. Still, he admitted that he hadn't expected one of their key members to end up in this condition. With that, he ordered Yeo-Woon to hand over the injured cadet and reminded him of the rules. No student was permitted to wander outside the dormitories at night. Yeo-Woon acknowledged the instruction, bowing his head slightly in understanding. Before departing, the professor left a final remark that lingered in Yeo-Woon's mind. They would all need to learn how to adapt to the circumstances around them. As the instructor disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, Yeo-Woon stood in silence, replaying those words in his mind. Something about them felt deliberate, too deliberate. When he returned to his room, the weight of realization struck him. If his group was especially panicked, then others must have been attacked as well. This wasn't a coincidence or an unfortunate event. It was orchestrated. Yeo-Woon's thoughts sharpened. The attacks were part of a larger design. The true purpose of separating the groups during the draw now became clear. The examination wasn't just about skill or cooperation. It was about survival and cunning. Each group had been made aware, directly or indirectly, of its potential opponents. By doing so, the Academy had quietly encouraged them to sabotage and eliminate competition before the test even began. A grim understanding settled over Yeo-Woon. This was the Demonic Academy after all, its very foundation built on ruthlessness. The rules had never been meant to ensure fairness. They existed only to test how far one was willing to go. Yeo-Woon entered the room casually. The members of the 8th group sat scattered across the floor, their faces pale with uncertainty and gloom. He looked around and let out a sigh. He asked how long they intended to sit in despair now that their leader was gone. Startled, a few of the students stammered defensively, insisting they weren't sulking. Yeo-Woon's gaze sharpened. He pointed out that instead of uniting to pick a new leader or plan for the examination, they were sitting idly on the ground. To him, that looked no different from surrender. After a moment, one of the cadets muttered that even if they wanted to reorganize, there was no one capable of leading them. Mukum had been the only one trained and experienced in commanding formations. Without him, they were lost. Hobum, standing behind Yeo-Woon, stepped forward, his voice rising with conviction. He asked why they all assumed Mukum was the only one fit to lead. Could they really not see that Yeo-Woon was standing right before them? A man who had already proven his strength, judgment, and skill. The room fell silent. The words hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. The students exchanged uncertain glances, but slowly, realization began to spread among them. Then one cadet broke the silence. The 38th cadet, Lee Chan, raised his hand and voiced his support for Yeo-Woon's leadership. A hesitant voice voice followed, then another. One by one, hands began to rise. The murmurs grew into agreement until nearly the entire group had spoken in favor of Yeo-Woon. Even the 6 cadets who had previously followed Murim remained quiet. Faced with the overwhelming majority, they could only nod reluctantly. Yeo-Woon looked around the room once more to ensure everyone was united in their decision. He asked for final confirmation, and when every voice echoed a firm yes, a small, confident smile formed on his face. Then, with calm authority, he told them that he already had a plan, one that had been forming in his mind ever since their formation training began. At the dead of night, when silence blanketed the academy and every cadet was deep in sleep, a single figure slipped quietly out of the 8th group's dormitory. His face was concealed beneath black cloth, his movements light and deliberate as he made his way through the dim corridors. It was Yeo-Woon. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the path ahead as he navigated through the darkness. With a faint mental command, he activated Nano's night vision mode. The world around him brightened in shades of green and silver, every detail laid bare before his gaze. He moved without hesitation until he reached his destination, the entrance to the 7th group's quarters. The door was slightly ajar, allowing a narrow glimpse of the dim interior. Yeo-Woon peered through the gap, observing the rows of sleeping cadets within. Nano's mechanical whisper filled his mind, confirming that all 20 members were sound asleep. Satisfied, Yeo-Woon stepped inside, his footsteps silent against the wooden floor. He considered Nano's earlier scan, which revealed no match between these students and the masked assailant who had attacked Murim. Still, he remained unmoved. Whether they were guilty or not made no difference now. Moving methodically, Yeo-Woon approached each bed one by one. His fingers pressed swiftly against precise pressure points on the neck and chest of every cadet, rendering them motionless in their sleep. Within moments, 19 of them lay completely immobilized, their bodies frozen under his touch. When he reached the final bed, he approached the group leader. Just as he leaned in, the leader's eyes snapped open, glinting sharply in the dark. Before the young man could move or make a sound, Yeo-Woon's hand struck with perfect precision, silencing him instantly. The leader's body went limp, falling back onto the bed, unconscious before he even realized what had happened. Yeo-Woon exhaled quietly, his composure unbroken though his pulse quickened for a brief instant. From within his sleeve, he drew a long, thin needle that glinted faintly under Nano's vision. The man before him might have been innocent, but this night was not about guilt or innocence. It was about ensuring no one would interfere. With steady hands, Yeo-Woon inserted the needle into the leader's thigh, then his foot, and finally a few critical muscle points. Yeo-Woon had pierced the man's tendons and blood vessels with precise acupuncture needles. The cadet would not be able to walk for a while. Though he knew this one was not the culprit behind the ambush, Yeo-Woon felt no hesitation in his actions. He had no intention of harming without reason, yet mercy was a weakness he could not afford. With the 7th group subdued, his task there was done. Without wasting a moment, Yeo-Woon moved silently toward the 5th group's dormitory. The leader of that group, Woon-Ryu-chun, could not have been the masked assailant. The person Yeo-Woon had fought was clearly a man, and far more skilled in martial arts than Woon-Ryu. The attacker had to belong to the 6th group. He advanced through the corridor and entered the 6th group's dormitory. Nano confirmed that all 16 members inside were deeply asleep. The group, however, had 20 in total, even counting the 3 female students who stayed on the upper floor. One member was missing. That absence told him what he needed to know. The missing cadet was likely the strongest among them, the one capable of such an ambush. If they were on the first floor, they had already noticed his movements. Yet Yeo-Woon remained calm. He knew there was no need to target the group's leader. Retribution did not demand balance through title, only through consequence. If one had attacked his own, then one of theirs would suffer the same. For Yeo-Woon, justice was simple: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. By the time dawn approached, his quiet work was complete. The academy slept unaware of the shadows that had moved through its halls, and this was what had taken place before Yeo-Woon stood upon the stage for the lottery. From above, Lee Ha-ming watched in astonishment. If Yeo-Woon now stood as the leader of Group 8, it could only mean one thing: the young prince had already taken action in the shadows. Someone from the stealth sect had been struck before dawn. The hidden purpose behind the examination had not been lost on him. This cohort had begun to understand what true competition within the demonic academy meant. He rose from his seat and looked upon the gathered students. When he asked if all had drawn from the box, the response came in unison, sharp and disciplined. Ha-ming's tone carried an ironic calm as he spoke of fairness and honest preparation. The cadets knew better than to take them at face value. As the leader stepped down from the stage, handing over the slips of paper that would decide their matches, tension laced the air. Among them, one figure stood out. The leader of Group 6, Ha-Il-ming, glared intently at the others. From where he stood, Yeo-Woon observed him closely. His instincts sharpened. A quiet command passed through his mind, and Nano's scan began. Within moments, the response came. The body measurements, frame, and build of Ha Ilming were a perfect match to the masked assailant who had attacked Mukum. A faint smirk crossed Yeo-Woon's face. The hunt was over. The enemy had been found. Moments later, the first round of the second examination began. The Great Hall thundered with the command to fight, echoing through the air like the start of a war. The rule was simple. Whichever group subdued the other would claim victory. At Ha Meng's command, the test began. The sound of boots striking the dirt floor echoed through the Great Hall as both groups charged forward, shields raised, voices sharp with determination. At the forefront of Group 1 was Chun Mu-yeon of the Shadow Sect, a young master whose poise and precision were evident even amid chaos. The formation surged ahead with discipline, shields overlapping seamlessly as they advanced. Across the field, the third group mirrored their movements, clashing head-on without hesitation. Yet Mu-yeon's eyes were calculating. A brief pause, and then his command cut through the air. From the right flank, the formation shifted in an instant. His troops angled sharply into a diagonal line, breaking away from the expected collision course. Ha Meng, watching from above, recognized the maneuver immediately, a diagonal sweep designed to unbalance the opponent's defense. The third group never saw it coming. The right side of Mu-yeon's formation crashed into their flank like a tidal surge. The impact rippled through their ranks, throwing cadets off balance. One fell, then another, the shield wall breaking apart under the sudden shift of pressure. The left side faltered, and soon the entire formation began to crumble. Cries of confusion filled the arena. The new leader of the third group shouted desperately for his men to recover, but their lines were already in disarray. In the midst of the collapse, Mu-yeon advanced with clinical precision, driving his sword into the opposing leader's shoulder before he could regroup. The steel bit deep, and the cry of pain cut through the din. The defeated cadet clenched his teeth, but the words of surrender eventually escaped him. The match was over. From the viewing platform, Lee Ha Meng watched in silence, his thoughts steady and detached. The third group had not been weak. Far from it, yet the result was undeniable. Inwardly, he reflected with quiet disdain on their downfall. It was not strength they lacked, but adaptability. A pitiful defeat indeed. He announced the result of the first match. Group 1 had claimed victory and advanced. The following round between Group 2 and Group 4 concluded swiftly, with the fourth group emerging triumphant. Without pause, Ha Meng called for the next contenders to step forward. The 5th versus the 8th. Yeo-Won's gaze sharpened. It was finally their turn. Around him, the members of the 8th group wore uncertain expressions. Their morale was wavering, shaken by the loss of their previous leader and the weight of the coming battle. Yeo-Won sensed the hesitation in their movements, the unspoken doubt clouding their focus. That unease would cost them everything if left unchecked. He turned toward his group, his voice low but resolute. Fear was understandable, he told them, but surrender was not. He reminded them that this battle was not merely for survival, but for pride, for the right to remain in the academy and claim the strength they had fought to earn. He spoke of injustice, of the cowardice behind the attack that had crippled their former leader, and vowed that their enemies would not triumph through deceit. The determination in his voice stirred something within his group. They answered his call with unity, shouting their resolve to win. From above, Ha Meng observed the shift in their demeanor. Surprise flickered briefly across his face. He hadn't expected Yeo-Woon to command such presence, not from someone so recently thrust into leadership. Yet he reminded himself that raising morale was far easier than leading a true victory. Inwardly, he measured the young man with a calculating gaze. If Yeo-Won's fire burned true, he would stand as a tiger among cubs, but if it faltered under pressure, then he was nothing more than a kitten roaring at the wind. With that thought, Ha Meng lifted his hand and gave the signal to begin. The command reverberated through the air. The test had begun. Won-Ryu, the leader of the 5th group, stood at the front of her formation, her eyes fixed sharply on Yeo-Won across the hall. Discontent stirred within her chest. This was not the match she had wanted. Her plan had been to defeat Chun Mukum and prove her worth before everyone, to show that her strength and leadership surpassed the heir of the loyal clan. But fate had shifted. Now her opponent was Yeo-Won, a cadet burdened by a tainted lineage and a reputation for weakness. To her, this victory would mean nothing. It was beneath her. Yet the rules left her no choice. Her glare hardened as she thought with disdain that he did not even deserve to stand on that stage. Raising her arm sharply, she commanded her group forward. While his opponents charged, he summoned Nano within his mind. In response, the nanomachine activated, and augmented reality filled his vision, glowing lines and tactical indicators forming the blueprint of movement before his eyes. Yeo-Won raised his voice with calm authority, instructing his team to hold position. As the enemy drew near, Won-Ryu shifted her hand sharply and called for formation 2. Nano immediately detected the maneuver. In Yeo-Won's sight, a red outline formed around the opposing group, displaying their transition into an arrow-shaped formation designed to pierce through defenses. Nano's voice echoed in his mind, recommending a counter formation, the scale formation. Yeo-Won's lips curved slightly. The prediction had been correct. He knew there was no avoiding a direct clash, so he committed to the countermeasure. Raising his arm, he ordered ordered his group to shift formation. At his command, the members of the 8th group adjusted swiftly into position, their formation fanning outward like overlapping scales. Among the observers, Lee Ha-meng watched intently, his brow furrowed slightly at Yeo-Woon's choice. The scale formation, while clever in theory, relied entirely on the strength of the leader holding the front. Without that anchor, it collapsed instantly. To him, Yeo-Woon's decision appeared reckless, a bold but misguided attempt at strategy. He had expected brilliance, but perhaps he thought that he had expected too much. Won-Ryu charged forward with fierce momentum, her shield raised high and internal energy coursing through her limbs. The clash echoed through the drill hall as her shield collided against Yeo-Woon's. The impact resounded like the strike of metal against stone, dust scattering beneath their feet. To everyone's astonishment, Yeo-Woon did not falter. The audience, expecting the 8th group to collapse under the initial blow, instead saw them hold firm. Yeo-Woon's stance remained unbroken, the force of the attack dispersing evenly through his frame. A flicker of disbelief crossed Won-Ryu's face. The power she had poured into that strike should have crushed him outright. She felt the recoil tremble through her arm. From the stands above, Lee Ha-meng's eyes widened. He had expected Yeo-Woon to buckle instantly, but the boy had withstood the impact head-on. Within Yeo-Woon, a calm calculation settled beneath the surface. His internal energy was marginally inferior to Won-Ryu's, but the strength flowing through his muscles rivaled even that of his master Sub-Meng. That advantage alone gave him confidence. The corner of his lips curled into a restrained grin as excitement flickered in his gaze. Won-Ryu, however, felt her composure slipping. The exchange had not gone as planned. She could feel herself losing ground, her stance unsteady beneath the recoil. Panic laced her thoughts as she realized her formation's backline could not sustain this kind of pressure. Frustration flashed through her eyes. With a swift motion, she stepped back and called for a retreat. Her command echoed sharply across the formation, instructing her unit to fall back and reassemble into their default stance. Nano immediately analyzed the shift and relayed the data to Yeo-Woon. The overlay in his vision displayed the changing structure of the 5th group's movement. Without hesitation, Yeo-Woon countered. His voice rang with command as he called for Formation 3. His group moved with mechanical precision, guided by the clarity in his tone. Won-Ryu saw the change and took it for overconfidence. Her lips curved into a derisive smile. She recognized the setup, the same formation that had been used earlier by another group. To her, it was an act of desperation disguised as strategy. She thought his internal energy might be impressive, but his technique, in her eyes, was crude and unpolished. Convinced that she had found his flaw, she prepared to strike again. Won-Ryu raised her arm and gave a sharp command to her group, ordering them into the 6th formation. Inside, she believed she had already deciphered Yeo-Woon's strategy. Though she grudgingly acknowledged the strength of his internal energy, she still considered his tactics predictable. The scale formation could only be countered one way, by piercing directly through its center. Once Yeo-Woon was isolated at the front, she planned to crush him swiftly and decisively. But across from her, Yeo-Woon's faint smirk told another story. The subtle gleam in his eyes revealed satisfaction rather than concern. The very move she believed would end him was what he had wanted all along. As the 5th group advanced, Yeo-Woon's group moved rapidly into position, guided by precise coordination and silent command. Within moments, the battlefield's shape changed completely. The 8th group was no longer in a 4-line structure. Instead, they had unfolded into a semicircular stance, spreading out like the wings of a bird. Panic rippled through the 5th group. Their once straight path had become a trap. From both flanks, Yeo-Woon's units began to close in, gradually surrounding them. Won-Ryu's voice rose in alarm as she ordered her soldiers to brace for attacks from either side. Even she could not hide her shock at the sudden reversal. Yeo-Woon's calm, decisive command rang across the field once again, calling for the 2nd formation. Won-Ryu's heart pounded as she recognized the number. It was supposed to be the arrow formation, but nothing matched what she saw before her. The confusion deepened among her troops. Some shouted directions, others hesitated, unable to comprehend the assault patterns closing in. Frustration coursed through Won-Ryu as her fury erupted in disbelief. Her face flushed crimson as she screamed, realizing far too late what had happened. The trick that had left her completely outmaneuvered was deceptively simple. Yeo-Woon had reversed the numbering of his formations. While every other group followed the standard numerical order they had all been trained with, Yeo-Woon had inverted it entirely, using familiar calls as bait to mislead his opponents. Before she could even issue a new command, the trap had fully closed in. The 8th group advanced in unison, their movements sharp and synchronized as the sparrow's wing formation constricted around the 5th group like an iron snare. The night before, in the still silence of the dorm, he had gathered his group and spoken with quiet resolve. His plan had been precise. Every formation number they used would be reversed. What appeared to be a tactical call would, in truth, trigger an entirely different maneuver. It was simple, deceptive, and perfect against those who trusted the Academy's structure too blindly. Now, in the present, the results of that plan were laid bare. Won-Ryu's inner voice seethed with humiliation. Rage burned through her veins as she watched her group falter before the strategy of someone she had mocked only moments ago. And then Yeo-Woon raised his hand and gave the single command, "Forward!" His soldiers surged forward, their their momentum unified. With nowhere left to run, the fifth group's formation disintegrated. The will to fight drained from their eyes as hopelessness settled in. One by one, their shields slipped from their hands and struck the ground with hollow thuds. Wonryu's voice tore through the air, sharp with rage and disbelief. She screamed at her subordinates, ordering them to stand, to fight, to do anything but yield. But her cries were drowned by the crushing weight of defeat already hanging over them. Panic twisted into humiliation, her pride, once her armor, now cracked with every breath. The thought of losing, and to someone she had scorned so completely, burned through her chest. The faces of her peers flashed in her mind, each one mocking her downfall. The shame was unbearable. Consumed by fury, she snapped. A scream erupted from her throat as she lunged at Yeo-Woon, her blade howling through the air with murderous intent. The strike carried the signature energy of the Sound Clan's deadly technique, the Sword Energy Wave. Yeo-Woon, in one fluid motion, threw aside his shield and leapt upward, channeling his energy into the butterfly blade dance. The elegant arcs of his sword wove through the air, colliding with her enraged strike. Steel clashed against steel, each impact ringing like thunder through the drill hall. Yeo-Woon's counter came precise and unyielding, his blade tracing a flawless curve through the chaos. The sound of tearing metal echoed, a flash of red followed. Yeo-Woon's sword swept past her guard, slicing cleanly across her arm. Blood burst forth, scattering like crimson petals as the tip of his blade carved through the air. The elegance of Submeng's butterfly blade dance had captivated them for a heartbeat, until reality struck. The spectators stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. Something hit the ground with a dull thump. The scent of blood filled the hall, sharp and heavy. A trail of crimson spread beneath Wonryu's feet as silence descended upon the arena. Wonryu froze and scanned the hall, her eyes darting around in disbelief. Only then did the full horror register. Her right arm lay severed, and the pain and shock ripped through her. A shriek tore through the drill hall. Her scream echoed across the training ground, carrying with it the raw terror of disbelief. She fell to her knees, clutching at the stump of her arm as blood gushed freely. Her wails grew frantic, broken by ragged gasps. The instructor of the fifth group rushed forward immediately and pressing on the vital blood point at her shoulder to stem the bleeding. His voice rose in urgent shouts, but nothing could drown out Wonryu's hysteria. Yeo-Woon stood motionless. He lifted his training sword and studied his reflection in the polished steel. His gaze was calm, though his mind weighed heavily on what had just occurred. Inside, his thoughts flowed with detached precision. The blade had not been real steel, yet the impact had been enough to sever flesh. He knew he had stopped her sword technique before it could fully unleash its destructive force, but the incomplete fighting form had still caused unintended damage. The limits of the training sword had spared no mercy. Wonryu continued to scream, clawing at the stump and vowing with wild, bloodied fury to kill Yeo-Woon. Yeo-Woon's eyes darkened. A faint glint of remorse flickered beneath the surface of his composure, though he said nothing. The instructor's voice broke through the chaos, loud and commanding, declaring the result of the match. The eighth group had emerged victorious. At once, Yeo-Woon's cadets rushed toward him, surrounding him in exhilaration and disbelief. From the distance, Lee Ha-meng observed in disbelief. He couldn't believe Yeo-Woon had just executed the 7 links of the dancing butterfly. Though the boy still lacked internal power, his form alone was on par with Submeng's. Ha-meng's thoughts turned sharply. That drunkard, what had he done? No, this wasn't Submeng's doing. Yeo-Woon had grown on his own, and in more ways than one. Within just 21 days, he had shown deep understanding of strategy, the mind of a tactician, and the boldness to sever Wonryu's arm without hesitation. To Ha-meng, it was clear. Yeo-Woon was a born prodigy. For a moment, he even thought he should have taken the boy under his wing before Submeng made his move. But then he shook the thought away. That would not have been right. Still, as he watched Yeo-Woon stand there in victory, Ha-meng was certain the boy must have mixed feelings about what had just happened. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.